Hello guys, let's go see new Reddit story.
Title: The Shocking Double Life of Grace, a Lesson in Moral Obsession. Hey Reddit, I don't know how to even start telling this, but I feel like this is something I have to get off my chest. This is my story about someone who was once my friend, someone who preached morality and purity as if it was a religion, yet ended up being one of the most messed up people I've ever encountered. It's crazy how people obsessed with morals and purity often end up doing the most horrible things. It all started a few years ago when I met Grace. She was one of those people you meet and immediately know they've got a higher calling, you know? The ones who constantly talk about their strong values, how they're better than the world because they stick to a strict moral code. In Grace's case, she was deeply into the purity culture. We met through a community volunteer group, and she instantly stood out. Not in a flashy way, but in this unsettlingly righteous manner. She was involved in everything from helping at food banks to organizing protests against any form of immorality she could find. You know, things like abortions, LGBTQ+ rights, and pretty much anything that didn't align with her strict interpretation of the Bible. For context, Grace was not just religious, she was obsessed. She would literally quote scripture in almost every conversation. Everything in her life had to adhere to her moral code, and she would shame others for not meeting those standards. At first, I didn't think much of it. She was friendly, and I admired her dedication to causes she believed in. But as time went on, I started noticing something off. It wasn't her purity obsession, that was easy to ignore, but her judgmental, almost condescending attitude. She would act like she was morally superior to everyone around her. I'd see her glance at people with tattoos or piercings, or hear her making snide remarks about people who were openly gay or who drank alcohol. You could feel the disdain in the air, and it was uncomfortable. I'm not perfect, but I'm not the type to shy away from questioning someone's beliefs when they cross the line. I started gently pushing back on some of her views, which led to some awkward conversations, but she always had an answer, a justification. And then, one night, things took a very different turn. We were all at a group dinner, a mix of old friends and some new faces, when Grace started lecturing about the importance of saving yourself for marriage. It wasn't the first time she had shared her views on chastity, but this time she went further, making the whole group uncomfortable. She talked about how she would never, ever give in to temptation, how she believed her purity was the only thing that truly defined her as a good person. I felt the tension in the room, but no one said anything. I was about to speak up, just to lighten the mood, but before I could, one of the newer members of the group, a young woman named Lily, made the mistake of politely disagreeing. She mentioned how she believed in love and personal choice, and how no one should be shamed for their decisions. Grace's eyes went cold in an instant. Her face twisted with disdain, and she snapped back with something along the lines of, "Well, I guess that explains why your life is such a mess, doesn't it? You can't expect to live in sin and not deal with the consequences." I saw Lily flinch, but she tried to maintain composure. It was a shocking moment, and I didn't know how to react. But the tension didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, things started escalating. Grace's judgmental streak became more obvious. She started isolating people she deemed unworthy of her presence, people who didn't adhere to her puritanical code. I wasn't the only one who started noticing. And then, the twist. Grace, who had been preaching purity to everyone around her, was caught in a shocking scandal. The whole thing blew up one weekend when some pictures surfaced of her, drunk at a bar, making out with a man she wasn't even dating. No one could believe it. The woman who had judged others for their behavior, who had made it her mission to make people feel ashamed of their own decisions, was the very person doing something she had condemned for years. At first, Grace denied everything, claiming the photos were taken out of context, that she had been misled by the man. She called it a moment of weakness, but people saw right through it. And it wasn't just the photos. Rumors started to spread, things about her having secret relationships with men who weren't her husband, about her constant emotional manipulation, even some disturbing stories about her purity pledges that seemed more like a form of control than actual values. To make things even more confusing, the people who had been closest to her, her husband, family members, and friends, started distancing themselves from her. I started hearing rumors about her having used her purity as a form of control over people. She didn't just preach her beliefs, she weaponized them. It was almost as though she was using her so-called moral superiority as a way to hide the very things she was secretly doing behind closed doors. She couldn't handle it when people didn't follow her rules, and yet, here she was, living a completely different life. It was like the entire community that had looked up to her was now realizing just how manipulative she had been. The more I learned about Grace's secret life, the more I saw how dangerously obsessed she had become with controlling others through the guise of morality. She used her position as the pure, moral one to shame people and make them feel less than, all while hiding her own flaws. It wasn't until her mask cracked that we all realized just how far she had gone. In the end, Grace vanished. I don't know where she went or what happened to her, but the damage was done. The people she had manipulated, shamed, and hurt were left picking up the pieces, while Grace got away with her own personal secrets, pretending to be the innocent victim of a smear campaign. And that's the story. I guess my point is that it's so often the people who are obsessed with being morally pure and better than others who end up being the most damaged and toxic. It's easy to point fingers at others for their mistakes, but when you're too caught up in your own self-righteousness, it blinds you to your own flaws. And that's where real harm happens. If you take anything from this, it's to be cautious of those who preach purity without question. Because, from where I stand, those are the people who are hiding the darkest secrets. So, after everything happened with Grace, I spent a long time reflecting on how easily people can fall into the trap of moral superiority. It's almost like a defense mechanism. By casting judgment on others, you create a barrier between yourself and any scrutiny. You can point at the flaws of others to distract from your own. I think that's exactly what Grace was doing. Her obsession with purity wasn't about protecting herself or others. It was about controlling the narrative, about positioning herself as the moral authority. And in doing so, she could keep people at arm's length and avoid having to confront her own demons. I saw how it played out with the people who were closest to her, too. Her family, friends, and even her husband seemed caught in this strange dynamic. They were all expected to adhere to her moral code, but there was a palpable tension, like everyone was walking on eggshells, afraid to make a mistake or be caught out. Her husband, in particular, seemed so lost in the haze of her righteous fervor that he almost became a passive participant in the manipulation. I heard from mutual friends that he had become increasingly distant, not just from Grace, but from everyone else. It was as though she had built a moral fortress around their life, and he had no way of escaping. And here's the part that really got to me. When I saw how many people Grace had managed to twist into thinking they were somehow less than because they didn't follow her rules, it really hit me. There were people in our community who had stopped dating because they felt like they had to wait for the right one according to Grace's standards, even though they were clearly not happy. There were people who had stopped expressing their sexual identities out of fear of being judged or condemned. It wasn't just about personal choices anymore. Grace's obsession had morphed into a tool for isolating others and making them feel unworthy. It was like she wasn't just imposing a moral code on the world. She was imposing her own version of a perfect life on everyone she met, and if they didn't meet her expectations, they were somehow inferior. And when she was caught, it was clear how much damage she had done, not only to herself, but to the people who had bought into her moral authority. What struck me most was how Grace had to turn her life upside down to keep her perfect image. That was the most horrifying part. The pictures at the bar were only the beginning. There were whispered stories about how she had emotionally manipulated people into believing they were too flawed to make their own decisions. How she would use their vulnerabilities to control their actions, making them feel like they had to earn forgiveness or approval. It's one thing to be hypocritical in your personal choices, but when you start using your so-called moral purity to control and harm others, that's when things get truly sinister. I think what made it so difficult for me to process was that I couldn't figure out how someone could justify that kind of behavior to themselves. I mean, Grace genuinely believed she was doing the right thing. She thought her obsession with purity was a form of service to God, and that she was helping others by holding them to the same standards she had set for herself. But what I realized over time was that she wasn't helping anyone. She was trapping herself in a cage of moral expectations, and in turn, she was trapping everyone around her. I remember one conversation I had with Lily after the whole thing exploded. She was still trying to make sense of everything, but what she said stuck with me. Grace taught me that purity isn't just about what you do. It's about how you make others feel about themselves. That hit me hard. It wasn't just about the personal choices we make. It was about how we make others feel, how we allow our judgment to influence their sense of self-worth. For a long time, I couldn't shake the feeling that Grace's obsession with purity had created a ripple effect that damaged everyone she touched. She may have left the community, but the scars she left behind, of shame, isolation, and self-doubt, lingered long after she was gone. The most unsettling part is that I know Grace isn't the only person like this. There are so many people out there who hide behind their morals to avoid facing their own vulnerabilities, who turn purity into a weapon. And the sad truth is that they often don't realize how much harm they're causing. They become so consumed with their righteousness that they forget what it means to truly be kind, to understand others, and to embrace the imperfections in themselves and those around them. Anyway, I guess I'm sharing all of this because I don't want to keep quiet about it anymore. I don't want to be complicit in a world that rewards this kind of behavior. It's crazy how these so-called moral paragons often have the darkest secrets. It's a wake-up call for me and anyone else who thinks they're immune from falling into this trap. We need to be careful about putting people on pedestals based on their self-proclaimed purity because, more often than not, those are the ones with the most to hide. Thanks for reading, Reddit. If this resonated with you in any way, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I'm just trying to make sense of it all.